Hello and welcome to MSIN 0020 Strategy by Design. This is the fourth online lecture, and we're in the second part of strategic analysis, which is what to think about. So this week, we continue with the idea of strategic analysis and move on to examining how strategy is affected by the external and internal environment of the organization. In the sense, while last week was about ways of thinking strategically, types of goals, risk, and uncertainty, this week is about what to think about. In other words, resources and the internal and external environment. So far, we've defined strategy as choosing and taking actions in response to situations in order to achieve desired outcomes. To strategize is to analyze the situation to enable you to choose the actions you want to take. And before undertaking the strategic analysis, you should ask two key questions. The first one is, what kinds of goals are we pursuing? All achievable goals are conceptually easy to achieve when you are certain about the possible actions you can take and the outcomes these actions will produce. But in a situation of uncertainty, some types of goals are easier to achieve than others. So one question to ask yourself now to check whether you understood last week's lecture is, how does the nature of a goal affect how easy it is to achieve under conditions of uncertainty? Might want to take a moment. All achievable goals are conceptually easy to achieve when you are certain about the possible actions you can take and the outcomes those actions will produce. But in a situation of uncertainty, some types of goals are easier to achieve than others. How does the nature of a goal affect how easy it is to achieve under conditions of uncertainty? You might want to take a moment here and pause the video to think about this and see whether you understood last week's lecture. Now, if you recall, superordinate goals are higher level or more abstract. They are relatively easier to achieve in uncertain situations because they offer more degrees of freedom. Because the goal is higher level and more abstract, there are more ways that you can find to achieve that goal compared to a lower level, more concrete one. Now, the second question to ask is whether the situation is risky or uncertain. This is also a vital question because risk and uncertainty are not the same thing, and they require different strategy. Risk is when you don't know what exactly will happen, but you know all the possible outcomes and you know how likely each of those outcomes is. Risk is therefore measurable uncertainty, which, because you can measure it, you can eliminate. Essentially, risk is not truly uncertain at all. So throwing dice or flipping a coin would qualify as a risky situation. And you know all the possible outcomes and how likely they are. We almost never are in situations of true risk. Instead, we are usually in situations of true uncertainty, where we don't know what exactly will happen, and we also don't know all the possible outcomes, how likely each outcome is, or how much we want each outcome. True uncertainty is uncertainty that cannot be measured and eliminated. So this is why risk and true uncertainty require fundamentally different approaches to choosing and taking action. And unfortunately, risk and true uncertainty almost always show up together. If you recall from last week's lecture, a bit of true uncertainty contaminates the situation and turns it into an uncertain situation. You also can't know for sure if you're facing a risky or truly uncertain situation, because the future is always, by default, truly uncertain. So maybe it's better to always approach situations as if they're truly uncertain and strategize accordingly. This is a question for you to think about. In any case, uncertain situations definitely need a different way of choosing how to act. In other words, they need a different approach to strategy. Now, design, as I've said before, offers one way to update conventional strategy to be more appropriate for uncertain situations because, like strategy, design is about figuring out how to act to change an existing situation into a desired one. But the difference is design often has to deal with obviously uncertain situations, where the uncertainty comes from one or more of the sources we talked about before. So, what is strategy by design for uncertainty? It's basically what Sean would call a reflective conversation with the situation. You don't commit all at once. Instead, what you do is you experiment with problem definitions and possible solutions. You listen to the results of your experiments. And by listening to the results of your experiments, you both know whether or not the experiment succeeded and also whether you need to reframe and redefine the problem statement in the first place. And one thing that you always do is you step back often to consider the situation at different scales of analysis. So situations, as we said before, can be truly uncertain in three main ways. The first way is we're uncertain about what actions are possible in the first place. The second way is that we're uncertain about what outcomes a particular action will produce. And we can also be uncertain about what goals, in other words, what outcomes we actually want to achieve. So the design approach to strategy, which is iterative and reflective, helps you cope when you're experiencing this third type of uncertainty, not knowing even what the problem is that is being solved. So that was basically the first part of strategic analysis, thinking in a meta sense about the problem that you're trying to analyze and the situation you're trying to analyze. Now for strategic analysis part 2, we go into the things that you are actually looking at. So if the first part of strategic analysis was how to think broadly, the second part is looking at what to think about. One basic way to think about the strategic situation, in other words, the context in which an organization sets goals and chooses actions to achieve them, is to consider what lies outside the organization and what lies inside it. This is, obviously, the external environment and the internal environment. The strategic situation is what the business has to respond to when setting strategy to achieve its goals. One simple way to think of the situation any business faces is in terms of what's inside and what's outside the boundaries of the business. Inside the boundaries of the business are people, teams, subgroups, processes, informal and formal hierarchies, tangible and intangible assets. These make up the organization and allow it to do its work. Outside the boundaries of the business is the business environment. In the business environment are other competitor companies, markets, suppliers, consumers, laws and regulations, public opinion, the current and future state of technology, and the physical/natural environment. These determine what the organization is allowed to do and how it is allowed to do it. Now, the conventional approach is to think of the organization's inside as holding resources and the organization's outside, the environment, as imposing constraints on the organization. We'll start by looking at how to think conventionally about what's outside the business, the external environment. The external environment is essentially a set of forces that act on the business. These forces can include other businesses, government regulations, and customers. Now, when thinking about the business's environment, 3 dimensions might be useful to consider. Where is the environment located on the continuum between friendly and hostile, on the continuum between stable and dynamic, and on the continuum between simple and complex? Because strategy has to respond to the forces acting on the business, there is no universally correct strategy. What's appropriate depends at least partly on what the environment is that the business faces. For instance, imagine Uber operating in a friendly environment, like its home city of San Francisco, where it can launch whatever product it wants, versus a hostile environment, like Paris, which banned taxi sharing in 2018 and caused Uber to have to withdraw a product called Uber Pop. If organizations don't adopt the right strategies, they don't survive, and management's role is to evaluate the environment and pick the right strategies. So when you're looking at an environment, one of the things that you can look at is the continuum between stability and dynamism. An environment is relatively stable if it changes only infrequently, maybe because its core technology seldom changes or it is not attractive for new entrants. Conversely, an environment where core technologies are continually being updated or developed, or where new competitors continually enter, is definitionally more dynamic. Commodity businesses like a bottled water business, Nestle Waters, tend to operate in relatively stable environments, while consumer technology and cutting-edge science businesses like aneutron fusion power generation tend to operate in relatively dynamic environments. Another continuum is between simplicity and complexity. An environment is relatively simple if businesses in it don't need to navigate many details, such as regulation or technology, to do their work. Conversely, an environment is relatively complex if it has profuse and interacting regulations and draws on many interdependent technologies. Low-tech extraction and manufacturing businesses tend to operate in relatively simple environments, like corrugated cardboard box manufacturers, or those operating in highly regulated industries such as healthcare tend to operate in relatively complex environments, such as spaceflight engineering. And the final dimension is friendliness versus hostility. An environment might be considered friendly if it is structured so that organizations in the environment find it easy to operate and make a supernormal profit. Conversely, if an environment is filled with competitors constantly driving down supernormal profit, or legislation or culture that makes doing business really onerous, it might be considered hostile. Government monopolies tend to operate in relatively friendly environments, like a Russian oil monopoly, while discount retailers tend to operate in relatively hostile, highly competitive environments, like low-price groceries and supermarkets. If businesses are operating in the same environment, it makes sense that they'll face similar pressures and demands, and so that they'll be approximately similar to each other. For instance, if you try to set up a bank account at a bunch of different banks, you might have a slightly different user interface and process each time, but you'll ultimately have to submit the same documents because all banks have to comply with the same regulations about verifying a new customer's identity and that the new customer is not a money launderer. This is an example of how the environment, in this case the regulatory environment in which businesses operate, affect them in similar ways. However, though businesses operating in the same environment face similar pressures, these pressures are seldom completely identical from business to business. So good strategic analysis is, in part, developing the ability to look closely at the business environment and figure out how your particular part of the environment is different from that of your competitors. To take an example, though all banks have to ultimately work more or less the same way, money comes in, the bank does something to it to make more money, the specific things each bank does will be slightly or even very different from each other. So Julius Baer is a bank for a relatively small number of very high net worth individuals with a lot of money. The minimum account opening balance is in the hundreds of thousands of euros or even millions of euros. They're not going to provide the same services as a regular consumer bank like HSBC, which will open an account for people like you or me, or a commercial bank like JP Chase, which services primarily businesses. The customer-facing facilities, like banking lobbies of each of these banks, will obviously also look very different to be in line with the expectations of the specific types of customers each bank serves and tries to serve. The crucial thing to note here is that each of these three banks has not only got different strategies for being successful, they probably have chosen to pursue different goals as well. For instance, Julius Baer and JP Chase don't want to serve the multitudes the way HSBC does. But the external environment is not the only thing influencing what a business chooses to do. The other major consideration in strategic analysis is to look at what a business is able to do because of the resources it has internally. In other words, to ask, what does the business's internal environment look like? Broadly, you can think of the internal environment as stuff that the business has which lets it do what it needs to do. You can split them into three groups that are related but different from each other. The first is resources, both tangible and intangible things. Examples of tangible resources include a factory filled with production equipment, a bank account filled with cash, intellectual property in the form of patents or trade secrets, or offices in many countries. The second category is capabilities. The difference between resources and capabilities is that resources are assets that the business does things with, while capabilities are the business's ability to do things with stuff. An example might make the difference easier to understand. A laptop computer is a resource, it's a thing, but the ability to use the laptop computer to write a strategic plan is a capability. And the third category is resource bundles, which are interconnected sets of resources and capabilities, often straddling different functions in a business. So an example of a resource bundle might be the ability to combine a factory full of CNC milling machines with a hardware design team and a logistics supply chain to produce extremely high specification cell phones, like Apple does. So what makes assets strategic? And here when we talk about assets, we're simply saying what the business has inside of itself, its resources, its capabilities, its resource bundles, so that it can do what it's trying to do. So the first thing is, if an asset isn't valuable, it cannot be strategic. So all strategic assets must at least be valuable. Now, not only valuable, it also has to be rare, because if it's valuable but not rare, it may be useful, but other people have it too. Other businesses have it as well. And so it isn't strategic. It doesn't allow you to outcompete anyone else because other people might have the same asset. So assets are strategic when they are both valuable and rare. And then once you've got a valuable and rare asset, what makes a strategic asset more strategic is if they are hard to imitate, which is the meaning of inimitable, and if they cannot be substituted for by other things that work in similar ways. Now, it's important to note that assets in themselves do not confer advantage for a business if that business isn't organized to capture the value from them. So a business has to organize its management systems, its processes, its policies, its organizational structure, and its culture to be able to use its valuable, rare, and costly to imitate resources and capabilities. Only then can the business achieve sustained competitive advantage. So one example of this might be if you've got a factory full of CNC milling equipment, but as a business, you don't have an R&D team that can design cell phones that take advantage of that factory full of CNC equipment. An asset that may be strategic, it may be valuable, it may be rare, it may be inimitable and non-substitutable. But if as a business, you don't have the organizational structure and the internal talent, for instance, in order to be able to use this valuable, rare, inimitable, non-substitutable resource, you won't be able to take advantage of it. Now, we should expand the idea of resources and constraints. The conventional approach is to think of the business's internal environment as holding resources and the external environment as imposing constraints. But this is incomplete. The external environment can also offer resources to a business, and the internal environment can impose its own constraints on the business. To see how this works, think about starting a small product business pre-Amazon. You'd have to design the product, have it be manufactured, keep the inventory, handle the fulfillment, and do the accounting for the business. Nowadays, though, with a new service by Amazon called FBA, Fulfilled by Amazon, you can outsource to Amazon the expensive to build part, which is the inventory and fulfillment system. You no longer need to build a warehouse and staff it with people who can manage your stock and ship things out. You can now let Amazon do it. So the external environment for small product businesses in markets where Amazon offers FBA is now much more helpful. Services other businesses provide are part of the external environment too, and they can be resources to your business. Now, the same thing is true about knowledge. The world now knows much more about manufacturing semiconductors than it did 25 years ago. So microchip companies today are able to do much more than they did 25 years ago. More generally, if the external environment is well suited for the business's particular internal configuration, it's also beneficial. For instance, think back about a decade where old, stodgy tech firms had a bad rep, like Microsoft, and new snazzy tech firms had a good one, like Google. This, among other things, let Google acquire non-corporate consumers much more easily than Microsoft could, which was important in the browser wars. Remember back a few weeks when we did the case on Netscape? One important thing to note is that organizations can do things like buy competitors, start alliances, lobby governments, fund research in universities, start nonprofits, and advertise in order to change their environments to become more beneficial to them. The internal environment can also limit what a business can do. Imagine a hospital in a rural town without an emergency room or emergency medicine trained doctors. If there is a sudden natural disaster in the area with many casualties all requiring ER care, the hospital's organization, in other words, its existing hierarchy and ways of working, will simply be inadequate for taking the right actions in that situation. And if there is, instead, a sudden outbreak of a highly contagious virus in the area and the hospital is not equipped with enough personal protective equipment, the doctors and other frontline staff might go on strike, preventing the hospital, again, from taking the right actions in the situation. Organizations can change internal constraints by, for instance, reorganizing and hiring different people, negotiating with stakeholders, unwinding investments, or investing in different areas. So much for looking at the internal and external environments. Let's now take a step back. With all that in mind, we come back to doing strategy, right, and how we do strategy. So what you see on screen is the normal or conventional view of strategy. You basically do it very linearly. You evaluate the situation, choose your strategies, and you implement your choices. The first question for you is, what's missing? You might want to pause the video here for a bit and think about it. What's missing is a consideration of goals, or as we've also called it in the past, the problem definition. If you add that to this conventional way of doing strategic analysis, you begin by defining the problem, which is to say identifying what goals you're trying to pursue. Then you evaluate the situation, then you choose strategies, then you implement the choices. But even this slightly better way to do strategic analysis is still very linear. And the question is such a linear process of strategic analysis and strategy appropriate for risk or for uncertainty? You might want to take a little pause to give that a consideration. In fact, this cyclical process of doing strategy analysis is probably more appropriate for uncertainty. This process of strategic analysis begins with specifying what problem you're trying to solve or what goal you're trying to pursue, and then the same stages as before of doing research to evaluate the situation and choose strategies, then implementing the chosen strategies. The difference here from the linear model that we've seen so far is that after you implement a chosen strategy, in this cyclical model, you stand back and ask yourself whether the results of that implemented strategy, the actions you took, actually solve the problem, and in fact, whether, given what you learn from your evaluation and hypothesis development, the problem is correctly specified in the first place. The benefit of this cyclical approach to strategic analysis is that it offers opportunities to reflect on your understanding of the situation and of the problem itself. So let me just summarize what this lecture has been about. When analyzing a business's external environment, you should think about where it lies on the continuum between being stable and dynamic, the continuum between being simple and complex, and the continuum between being friendly and hostile. You should also ask, is the environment the business faces the same as or different from what its competitors face? And is that environment supportive or repressive of what the business does? Then think about how these all affect the business's goals and the actions it takes to achieve them. When analyzing a business's internal environment, you should think about what its resources, capabilities, and resource bundles are, what makes those assets valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable, and whether or not the business has organized itself so that it is able to take advantage of those assets, and also how those assets restrict what the business does. Then think about how these all, taken as a whole, affect the business's goals and the actions it takes to achieve them. Let's now take a step back and bring the last few weeks together. The first 4 questions on this slide are what we've spent the last few weeks talking through. Developing an understanding of the business's goals, whether it is facing a risky or uncertain situation, and the opportunities and constraints from the business's internal and external environments. These first 4 questions provide a frame as well as the contextual information that you need to help you then gather information and do the thinking needed to answer the last 2 questions. And you won't need a lecture or readings to understand how to answer those last 2 questions. It always depends from case to case, and it really does come down to what people sometimes call common sense. All right, let's try and apply some of this thinking to a concrete case by trying to answer the questions in the red box. What are the business's goals and how are they prioritized? Is the situation it faces risky or uncertain? What are the constraints and opportunities that it faces from the external and the internal environment? And we'll try and answer these questions in the context of that case that you saw on Patagonia. So since you did the goals analysis 2 weeks ago on your own, I won't spend too much time on it. Essentially, you can make an argument based on the information in this article that Patagonia is clearly pursuing what they call good growth, the kind of growth that involves selling products that are made and consumed sustainably, in other words, with less waste and more repair, and which crowds out bad consumerism. This is a relatively superordinate goal since Patagonia is willing to go into almost any product or service area that fits the bill instead of doggedly sticking to one category. Therefore, it's in everything from new clothing to refurbished clothing and even in sustainable food products. The situation that they face, though, is uncertain. Recall the idea that you can have uncertainty as long as it isn't clear what the connection is between the actions you take and the outcomes you achieve. Patagonia is facing this situation. On the one hand, it wants good growth and is aware of the dangers of growth and consumerism, but on the other hand, it's uncertain if what Patagonia is doing is good growth or if it's good enough. And when we look at the external environment and the constraints it imposes on Patagonia, we see that it seems fairly friendly. There are not that many constraints, and those constraints are not that important for Patagonia anyway. One of the constraints is that anti-consumerism is not yet very mainstream, but this is balanced by the fact that thought leaders are pushing the idea. And in the early 2010s, in the context of when this article was written in 2015, the economy in the US was not particularly healthy, leading consumers to pull back from spending and reorient towards less frequent purchasing of products with enduring worth. Now, if we look at what opportunities the external environment presents, though, we see that the constraints actually also generate opportunities for Patagonia. At that time, there was not great competition for Patagonia. The competition didn't really make what consumers sought in terms of products with enduring worth, and there were therefore lots and lots of underserved high value customers, people who cared about sustainable products and mindful consumption, who are therefore the kinds of customers that are not being competed for and are available for Patagonia to go after. Now, if we look at Patagonia's internal environment and the resources it offers, it seems pretty clear that the internal environment for Patagonia is pretty resource full. It has enough money to be able to continue to develop its brand positioning as a sustainability, mindfulness oriented brand. And it does this by taking risky choices that optically support that positioning, such as adopting organic materials early or engaging in a broad, responsible economy marketing campaign. It also has enough money to invest in developing new product lines that are consistent with the brand positioning that might eventually develop into large businesses, such as packaged foods. Patagonia also have the money to invest in something which is quite important for how their business works, which is opening new stores in expensive prime locations so that Patagonia is correctly located to access its prime customer base, educated, affluent individuals who subscribe to the brand's values and positioning. Patagonia has also spent many years investing in different ways in building a very strong brand around sustainability. So some of the things it does are philanthropy, advertising, marketing campaigns, new product development, and things like the repairs program. The strong brand association with sustainability is a resource that helps Patagonia, apparently paradoxically, pursue growth without seeming to contradict its sustainability position. Now, the problem is, this is also a type of constraint. There is some cognitive dissonance to Patagonia pursuing growth as an anti-consumerist company, and this in some way explains the product and positioning work that Patagonia has done to push the idea of good growth, growth that allows Patagonia to continue to grow while not violating its commitment to reducing consumerism. So to summarize, Patagonia is trying to pursue profit through good growth. It does this by selling sustainable products to high-value, underserved customers. And the uncertainty in Patagonia's situation arises from its evolving understanding of what it means for growth to be good. The strategic analysis of Patagonia's situation suggests that the external environment is pretty friendly. It imposes few and not very significant constraints in that anti-consumerism is still marginal and the economy is slightly weak. But at the same time, Patagonia benefits in that the competition is weak and its best fit, sophisticated and progressive customers are therefore underserved. It's a good opportunity for Patagonia's chosen market positioning. Looking at the internal environment, Patagonia appears to have many resources, not least of which is enough money to invest in brand-consistent actions, such as developing new product lines like packaged food, a stable of stores in the right locations for its customers, and a strong brand anchored on sustainability. However, because of the uncertainty about what good growth means, Patagonia's strong brand also constrains what it can do as a company to grow. It can only grow by positioning its growth in a way that is compatible with sustainability. So now that you've seen this analysis for Patagonia, you should try doing it for Zara and Inditex, remembering, of course, the tips on reading cases from last week. On Moodle, in this week's section, you'll find a worksheet that will help you structure your thinking as you read sources of data. You can use this worksheet to organize your thoughts while analyzing any individual source of data, but you can also use it to organize your thoughts when analyzing multiple sources of data, for instance, when doing the research for your written assignment. The second side of that worksheet helps you think through those last two questions I was talking about, trying to connect up goals to actions, to the evidence of those actions, and how those actions help the business achieve those goals. And with that, we're done with the fourth online lecture for Strategy by Design. At this point, as I've said, you now have the ways of thinking and the frameworks necessary to do the contextual analysis for any case, including your written assignment. I hope you have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you again after you get back from scenario week 2.